This is a man's world. This is a man's world. But it wouldn't be nothing, nothing without a woman or a girl.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of It's a Man's World, the Genesis 3:16 Effect. I am your host, Haley Rose, curriculum developer at the Anastasis Center for Christian Education and Ministry, where our mission is to proclaim the restorative justice of God and the healing atonement of Jesus. If you are enjoying our content, please remember to like and subscribe. Follow the link in the description to check out our website as well. I am joined once again today by Rachel Darnall, our expert on the intersection of women's issues and Christian theology. Hi, Rachel.
Hi, Haley. It's good to be back. I'm excited for today's episode.
Great. So catch us up where we left off and where we're going today.
Yeah, last time we talked about women and rule, as you remember, and how in patriarchy, men like to do this game, this kind of king of the hill game, but they don't like to admit that they're playing that game. So they rationalize through theories like primogeniture, right of the firstborn, and pseudoscientific theories about the inferiority of women. So that's where we were last time. So, in this episode, we are talking about a related issue, which is women and education. And when we're thinking about education in this episode, we are thinking about education as formation. So, it's not just going to school and getting a degree to do a particular job. We're thinking about education in a broader way, where we're talking about full formation, where you are becoming wiser and more mature until you have reached full adulthood.
Let's start by talking about education as it was supposed to be. Proverbs 2, verse 6 says that the Lord gives wisdom. From his mouth come knowledge and understanding. I think all Christians would say they agree with that, but sometimes we hear something more like the Lord gives men wisdom and men give women wisdom. I don't like that. I don't subscribe to it, but I'm really wondering where people get that idea.
They get that from various places in the Bible, but
Mm.
one of the places that we're going to look at today is the creation and fall narrative in Genesis 1 through 3. The thinking goes that because we see God giving the commandment to Adam not to eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, that must mean that there's this pattern where God tells men things and then men tell women things. And this is kind of appealing, especially for a lot of what are called soft complementarians, because it gives them a way out of that religious misogyny that we talked about in episode 2. Because it makes it so that they can say, oh, Adam messed up. He was supposed to pass on this message to Eve and he got it wrong. It's almost like a game of telephone, you know, when you're a kid and you play the game and you pass the message around, and by the time it gets to the end, the message has changed. So that's the story, is that, oh, it's not Eve's fault. The message got lost in transmission.
I can see why that's appealing. It seems like it would sidestep the messy woman blaming stuff that we talked about in episode 2.
Right. I see why it's appealing. I see why people like that idea, but it actually creates more problems than it solves. So Marg Moscow has a article about this, and she does a really good job of showing all of the problems with this idea. And one of them is that it is just not in the text. You see God giving the commands to Adam in Genesis 2 before Eve has been formed. But that does not mean that God did not tell the command to Eve, or that he didn't directly instruct her. And the second problem is that this would imply that Eve did not have a direct relationship with God, and that everything was mediated to her by Adam. And that's very problematic, because if we think of God as a parent, this is like a parent saying to their child, when they ask a question like, oh, don't bother me, go ask your older brother, or something like that. Like, why would God not want to directly engage with Eve?
Yeah, I think that's so important because teaching is a part of God's parenthood. If Eve wasn't taught directly by God, she wouldn't have really been fully parented. She wouldn't be his daughter in a sense.
Yeah, and that's just such a sad way to look at things. And I think we can look throughout the Bible and see this reinforced, especially in the New Testament, the pattern that Jesus sets of having female disciples who travel with him and to learn from him. We see him directly teaching women in the story of the woman at the well. We also see him directly teaching Mary and Martha. And there's even that story in Luke 10 where Martha wants Mary to come back to the kitchen and help her. And Jesus says, no, she has chosen the better part, and I'm not going to take that away from her. So when we picture the Garden of Eden, we need to really be thinking of Adam and Eve, not just as husband and wife, but also as children of God, children of one parent. And they are both being carefully raised into wisdom and maturity.
Mm. Well, I have questions because this tree that God told Adam and Eve don't eat from it, that was called the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So if God cares so much about women's and men's education, why forbid Adam and Eve to eat from a tree that would give them knowledge, a tree that God made, right? And then Genesis 3:6 says that one of the reasons that Eve ate the forbidden fruit was that she saw that it would make her wise. That sounds good to me. So, was it bad for Eve to want to learn?
A lot of people think that. For instance, there is a book written by Virginia Fugate called On the Other Side of the Garden. And she has this to say. She says, the woman's fall into Satan's trap reveals her weakest and most vulnerable areas of temptation, an intense desire for knowledge and self rule. So she would certainly think that. But I think that the problem was not that Eve wanted wisdom, it was the way that she was going about getting wisdom. So James 1:5 talks about if anyone lacks wisdom, they should go and ask God, and he will give to them. He will give to anybody who asks generously. And the tree represents a alternative path to becoming wise, a path that does not involve asking God or depending on God. So it's a bypass around God.
Well, we saw that theme in episode 1 where you trust in creation instead of the creator.
Yeah, exactly. And we're going to see those two idolatry motifs that we talked about in episode 1. We talked about the Adam motif, which represents idolatry of the natural world. So we're going to see Adam looking to the natural world to try to understand himself, what's around him, even to understand God. And we're going to see this with Eve, but just like Adam turned to his source, the ground, Eve is going to turn to her source, which is Adam, and look to him to be her instructor, but also to be her reason for being educated. He is the one who passes judgment on her education, and it's all geared towards pleasing the man and aligning herself with his point of view. And she becomes subjugated by this because the man is not wanting to raise her up into a position where she can share dominion and exercise self rule. He is educating her in a way where he can more easily control her. So, education can be twisted into a tool for control instead of a tool to empower people. And in this episode, we're going to go into how women have been either denied education altogether or their education has been very engineered to keep women dependent and subordinate on men. And we're going to start with a flyby survey of women's education in America. And then part 2, we will have a special guest, and we're going to talk about a more contemporary example, which is the stay-at-home daughter movement.
Well, if we're talking about the history of women's education, I think we should come back to my old friend, your old friend, our old friend from episode 5, Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Right, Rachel?
Right. Rousseau. He's our favorite guy. I like to say that Rousseau is to education what I think Sigmund Freud is to psychoanalysis. He is important and he's influential on education for, good reason in some ways, but he is so cringe. And just like Freud, he has a bad habit of making things about sex that aren't about sex. And I mean things like political rights and education.
Of course.
So, to give you a sense of where Rousseau's head is at in regards to women's education, I will read a quote where he says, "The whole education of women should be relative to men, to please them, to be useful to them, to win their love and esteem, to bring them up when young, to tend them when grown, to advise and console them, to make life sweet and pleasant to them. These are the duties of women at all times and what they ought to learn from infancy." So that quote is from Rousseau's book called Emile, or On Education. And this is a book where he communicates his theory of education using this literary vehicle of a fictional student named Emile, who has conversations with his tutor, whose name is Jean-Jacques, just like Rousseau's name is Jean-Jacques.
Oh, okay. That makes sense now.
Mm-hmm. So let's talk about Rousseau's theory of education for boys. Emile is raised in isolation. His parents just give him to his tutor and he takes him off to the country. His education is radically self-directed. The tutor doesn't give him assignments or lessons. He just lets him explore the world and sort of find things out for his own. And he has very few external restraints. There's no punishments or discipline going on, so that he just learns by cause and effect and personal experience. So Emile is experiencing from a very young age this radical level of autonomy, like more autonomy than even you or I or a regular adult would experience.
That's a bit much, yes.
It's a bit much. Actually, a lot of people following the publication of Emile for the next 50 years or so were like, that's a bit much.
Calm down. You need to calm down.
You need to calm down, Rousseau. So what we are interested in, though, is the fact that Rousseau also has a lot to say about the ideal of female education. And he does this through another fictional character called Sophie. And Sophie is supposed to be Emile's ideal mate. And let's take a look at how she's educated compared to how Emile is educated. So she is educated in the home by her parents, because Rousseau believes that since her life is going to predominantly be in the home, she should be educated in the home. She is taught to be agreeable and submissive from an early age. And she's not raised, quote, in absolute ignorance, as Rousseau says, but she's also not overly brilliant. She's intelligent without, she's not intimidating, is a short way to say it. She's
okay,
she is also subjected to arbitrary restrictions, like restrictions that don't even have a good reason, so that she can just get used to not having her own way, because that is what her adult life is going to be like. So here is a quote to give you an example. He says, "From this habitual restraint arises a docility which women need all their lives, since they never cease to be subject either to a man or to the opinions of men, and are never suffered to render themselves independent of those opinions." And this really has no limit. It even extends to her moral values and her religion. He says that her religion should just be whatever her husband's religion is. This is another quote where he says, "Even if this religion be false, the submission with which the wife and daughter obey the order of nature cancels, in the sight of God, the sin of ignorance."
I just have to say something here. I think that every time someone speaks to me, and I say this as a therapist, they're always telling me something about themselves. And I think that Rousseau is telling us something about himself. Not about you and me, not about Emile and Sophie, but he's telling us something about himself. Just got to say that there.
Yeah, no, I think we will find that to be very much true the more that we find out about Rousseau later in this episode. But another thing we have to talk about with Rousseau is, and Sophie, is that Sophie has a role that is very important in Rousseau's paradigm. And it's that she is supposed to be actually the capstone of Emile's education, because she is how he becomes civilized. Emile has lived outside of society because his tutor took him outside of society, and he has no social skills.
It's like the Jungle Book or something.
It is exact, or like George of the Jungle or Tarzan or something. So she is supposed to help him get those social virtues that he needs to live in a society.
That's
the reason why this works is because like he likes her and he wants to marry her, and that's going to give him the motivation to learn social skills that he would not have done otherwise without, having some kind of force applied.
That is gross. We have actually addressed this in one of our plantation capitalism videos where we talked about a story exactly like that happened to someone who I know, where she was meant to civilize this man. It's so gross. But I think we do have to wonder, how important is Rousseau beyond just our personal anecdotes that we have in our personal experiences? Why does it matter? What one guy dead more than 200 years ago, why does he matter to us?
He matters more than you might think. We don't talk about Rousseau a lot these days, but in his day, he was the leading expert on childhood education. And in his day is the point right before the founding of America. So anybody who's thinking about education, they are thinking about Rousseau because he's really the only one who's written a book like this so far. And where we see this show up in America is that Rousseau was a very strong influence on Noah Webster. So everybody knows Noah Webster as the guy who wrote the dictionary, Webster's Dictionary. But he wrote also a lot of educational materials. He wrote the first textbooks that were used in American schools. So Noah Webster really set the agenda for early American education more than any one person.
Well, you also told me that he wrote like fanfic about Emile, right?
He literally did write fan fiction about Emile. And this fan fiction that he wrote was actually included in one of his textbooks that he wrote in 1785.
No, oh my goodness.
Okay. Yes, and let me tell you a little bit about it because this is very revealing, and you're going to see the parallels with Rousseau. So the fanfic is called Emilia, or The Happiness of Retirement. And retirement here does not mean like going to a retirement home when you're old. It means like living a private, secluded life.
Gotcha.
So he is writing a sequel to Emile, where we catch up with Emile and Sophie after they're married and they have kids, and one of their kids is a little girl named Emilia. And this whole story is about Emilia. And I'll read you a quote from a paper by Micah Harris. He says, Emilia is the only interesting character in Webster's piece. It is about how Emilia becomes the kind of woman who can pick a good husband, run a bright, clean, affectionate household, and generally exhibit the best aspects of sociability while avoiding the shallowness, falseness, and vanity that are all so often implied by what we call society.
It's giving trad wife.
It's giving trad wife. It's very giving trad wife. And a lot of people do not realize where this comes from, that it goes all the way back to Rousseau. And there's a reason for that. The American founders were not super excited about admitting that Rousseau had influenced them, at least not by the turn of the century. And there are a few reasons why. The first was the French Revolution. The French Revolution got weird. It got out of hand, and people were freaked out about it. So they were in a mood to moderate revolutionary principles, and Rousseau kind of fell out of favor with that. There was also the fact that Rousseau had pretty funky religious beliefs, and at the turn of the 19th century was the Second Great Awakening. So everybody was interested in making sure like our religion is right, and Rousseau was not so good on that. But the third reason, and probably the most important, is that the 1780s is when Rousseau's Confessions came out, where he did this whole like detailed diary of his life where he tells us everything that he's ever done. Most of it was bad. And people were a bit scandalized to find out that this guy, number one, like he didn't marry the woman that he lived with. He had married like his maid, who he called unintelligent and like questioned her mental stability. And he blamed her for the fact that he had abandoned his 5 infant children to the Foundling Hospital. And he said, oh, well, I had to because she would not have made a good mother.
I don't even have something snappy to say about that. Yes, Rousseau, we cancel you. You are a terrible person. You're so insecure that you pick a woman who is supposed to be worse than you, but you don't want to be intimidated by someone being intelligent. And then you blame her, and then you're a total hypocrite because you have all these opinions about how to raise the children. And then you give your own children away to a foundling hospital, which probably was not very nice. A foundling hospital back in the day, that's not where you send your children.
No, it's not. The foundling hospitals had a very, very high mortality rate. So we
Of
have
course.
no idea what happens to Rousseau's children because they just went to the foundling hospital and got lost. But they probably died there because statistically, that's what's more likely. And like I have not even got into how Rousseau had all of these opinions about we shouldn't have nurses because mothers need to be with their children and they need to be breastfeeding their children and not sending them to like a wet nurse. So like that is where that's why breastfeeding became like such a fraught thing, is because Rousseau, who sent his children off to die probably of starvation, had opinions about women breastfeeding. So that's just some context you should know about Rousseau.
Oh my goodness. I mean, so these guys are a problem. But I guess at least they wanted women to get educated. I mean, that's probably an improvement. That's not saying much, but I guess it was, right?
Yeah, it was an improvement because before this, we do have to remember that women really didn't have educational opportunities almost at all. We saw in episode 2 how there was this idea that women were more easily deceived. So there was a question even if women were educatable and if it was even possible to educate women all through the Middle Ages and early Renaissance. So Rousseau and Webster did help to normalize female education, and that was a good thing.
Well, let's give a warm round of applause to the wonderful friend of ours, Rousseau, and his buddy Webster, who at least educated women. Feel free to clap on your own if you are so moved. But you were telling me about this idea of Republican motherhood, which isn't what we think it is today, right?
Right. It doesn't have anything to do with the Republican Party. The word Republican in this phrase is just referring to the fact that America was a republic, and this is motherhood that has to do with the ideal republic. So Republican motherhood was a way to integrate women into civic life while still making sure that they were having babies, performing domestic work, and staying subordinate to men. And this was actually a major dilemma during this time because in both France and America, women had been deeply invested in the politics of the Revolutionary period. So, for instance, in America, you had housewives boycotting British goods like tea. They we remember how they pushed the tea off of the boat, and that started the revolution and everything. But even before that, women were actually boycotting British tea. They also, during the war, made homemade bullets from like their own household items. They wrote patriotic poems and essays. There's a picture in the slide of Phyllis Wheatley, and she wrote lots of patriotic works. They performed domestic work in the military encampments during the war, and some of them even disguised themselves as men and fought in battles. You'll see a picture on the left there of Molly Pitcher, and she's kind of this revolutionary legend who, when her husband was killed in battle, she took his place loading the cannons. So women were not out in the streets demonstrating for votes for women yet, but they did feel like after giving so much to the revolution, they kind of deserved to benefit from it in some way.
And that does parallel some of that French Revolution stuff. That makes sense. We've got a slide here from Abigail Adams, who was very direct about what women should have had. She said, she told John Adams that if he and his fellow delegates in Congress didn't, quote, remember the ladies, we are determined to foment a rebellion and will not hold ourselves bound by any laws in which we have no voice or representation.
And I wish I could say that John Adams had received that well. He did not. He kind of made a joke out of it. But instead of completely discouraging women from this political enthusiasm that they had, America's leaders decided that they were going to redirect all that energy along channels that they were a little bit more comfortable with. Enter Republican motherhood. So historian Sarah Evans writes that the founders solved the problem of female citizenship, or the problem that they didn't want to give women citizenship, by, quote, endowing domesticity itself with political meaning.
So their special new job was just do what you're already doing. Is that right?
Kind of. Yes and no. Republican motherhood was kind of progressive at the time because it shifted the primary responsibility of educating sons from fathers to mothers. And that does not sound particularly revolutionary to us, but before, women had been thought to be incapable of educating their sons because they did not have the moral judgment that they needed to raise boys into men. Between the 1700s and the 1800s, that stereotype totally reversed, and women were considered to be the moral sex, and they were kind of put on a pedestal. And the politicization of women's roles was a big part of why that happened. There was also the idea in Webster's writing that just like in Emile, women were supposed to be the civilizers of men. And this was very, very important to Noah Webster, that women were going to teach men the social virtues, and men were going to go along with that because they like women and they want to marry them.
This is really unfair. Like, you have no rights, but you are responsible for all of the success, all of the responsibility, none of the rights. So I can't tell if this whole Republican motherhood thing was a good or a bad thing. Did we go forward or back as women?
I mean, it's complicated. There's a saying that patriarchy is always negotiated. And I think Republican motherhood is a really good example of that, because all throughout the 1800s, education did help women to advance towards equality in some really important ways. But it also reinforced existing gender stereotypes, and it also brought in some new ones and some new problems, because when you put women on a pedestal and say they're the virtuous sex, that means men get to be the unvirtuous sex. You have that whole problem of like, you have no power, but you're supposed to change the world. And it was very limited. We need to understand that there was definitely a ceiling to how much women were allowed to learn, because they did not want to give them the idea that, hey, you can be educated and go earn money for yourself and
Right.
become independent.
And it's not the only time that education has been used to keep people subordinate in America either. Industrial education for African American children was a thing after the Civil War. White Southern planters saw education as a way to reestablish control over formerly enslaved workers. And so they founded the industrial boarding schools that focus on teaching manual labor and socializing Black children to be deferential to whites. Richard J. Altenbaugh writes in his book, The American People and Their Education, that for all intents and purposes, industrial education reflected the dual educational agenda of Southern planters during slavery: work, skills, training, and social control.
And that is exactly the same dynamics as were going on with Republican motherhood, where they realized, okay, we need to educate women because there are things that we want them to do, but it's all about teaching them to do menial labor, domestic work,
Yeah.
and just basically training them to be what men want them to be. And the result of that is a malformation, because that's not the way that people are supposed to grow. And Emma Hart Willard was a education reformer in the 1800s, and she has a really good quote about this. She says, "The education of females has been too exclusively directed to fit them for displaying to advantage the charms of youth and beauty. The taste of men, whatever it might happen to be, has been made into a standard for the formation of female character." So, what she's getting at is we're not just talking about becoming a female CEO, breaking glass ceilings, stuff like that. Like that's all great, and we encourage that. But this is really much bigger than what are you going to do when you grow up. This is about humans and the need to reach full maturity, whether you are a CEO of a Fortune 500 company or a stay-at-home mom.
You see, man.
It has been described as the most encouraging film of the year. Travel with Anna Sophia and Elizabeth Botkin into the homes of 7 extraordinary young women who have dared to defy the feminist culture in pursuit of God's plan for daughters. Their decisions have changed their families forever.
It's what we've been raised to believe, that somehow a woman who has not gone out to make her way, by the time she's 20, 21, 22 years old, she hasn't gotten that degree, she hasn't gotten that job, that somehow we have failed. But according to whom? According to whom have we failed? And who am I trying to please? And am I willing to sacrifice my daughter on the altar of pleasing men? I most assuredly am not.
We've just seen footage from Return of the Daughters, a 2007 documentary made by stay-at-home daughters about stay-at-home daughters. The Botkin family has been looked up to as poster children for homeschooling, Christian patriarchy, and the full quiver approach to family that we talked about in episode 4. Today, we are joined by Audrey Botkin, who became a part of the Botkin family when she married her husband, Benjamin Botkin. Welcome, Audrey.
Hey, y'all. I'm happy to be with you.
We're glad you're here.
Yeah.
Rachel, can you give us a really quick definition of a stay-at-home daughter?
A stay-at-home daughter, the way that we're talking about it, is somebody who is at home with her parents because of religious conviction. And it's this belief that daughters need to stay under their father's protection up until the very minute that they walk down the aisle and the father transfers his authority to the husband. So the authority goes from the father to the husband, so that there's not even 1 second where the woman is independent and does not have a man controlling her. So this is all bound up, like we were saying, with the Quiverful movement as well. So it's a lot about making sure that girls know this is what they're going to do with their lives. They're going to have lots of kids and they're not going to have time to do anything else, and they don't need to be educated to do anything else.
So it's kind of presented as like these women, it really struck me in that clip. They've made a choice. This is what they wanted. This is not fathers who lock their daughters up movement. This is a stay-at-home daughter. It doesn't even say anything movement name about the dads, right? So was it a choice? Now that you've done it, you're out of it, you got kids, was it a choice?
No, not in the way that they're trying to make it look like it is. Choice is a complicated word and a complicated concept. But when you are trained from your infancy that this is what you do to please God, and when, like in my case, my mom would constantly tell me and my sisters, you might think that you want to move out and live on your own, but like you wouldn't be able to make it out there because you can't make enough money, and like you have no idea how expensive things are and how hard it is to pay for an apartment and buy your own clothes and buy your own food. So it was constantly just this breaking down of your confidence. And, at no point did it occur to me or to her to think like, well, if I'm not prepared to stand on my own 2 feet in the world, like whose fault is that? Like, why did that happen? It's just like, it's the world's fault that you can't survive in the world, but you just need to stay here and be safe and let us tell you how to do your life until you get married, and we'll tell you how to do your life.
What about you, Audrey? Was it a choice?
Yeah, I think, there's there's just free will, free choice, and then like locking your daughters up. And I think this, in between, you can kind of avoid having to lock your daughters up if you have been trained to be submissive from a very young age and to kind of expect that this is your lot in life. I mean, I remember when I was 10 hearing for the first time a talk by Doug Phillips about basically that was the goal of a daughter's life, was to grow up and get married and have kids. And that felt very defeating. But by the time you might reach the age of, going to college, I certainly was I was conflicted for sure. I did want to go to school, but I also knew that I wanted to honor my parents, and I felt like because they didn't want that for me, I feared losing relationship with them, and I thought that the right thing, what I had been told was the right thing to do, would be to honor them by staying home and just waiting until I got married in their home.
Yeah. Well, it's not much of a choice when there's a gun to your head. Even if the gun is like you're making the wrong choice and you won't have your parents anymore because we disapprove of you, that's not really a choice. That's closer to coercion, even if it is gentler than real coercion.
Right.
And for me, it was not just that you would lose the relationship with your parents, but that the relationship with your parents, I mean, I experienced this growing up, but also the last week reading this literature for this episode, like it is all over the literature that your obedience to your parents, and particularly your father, is your obedience to God. And your disobedience is disobedience to God. So it's not fair, because you're being told you have a choice, but the choice is to obey God or disobey God. And obviously, if you're raised like in a very religious environment and you're a very like sincere, pious Christian child, you're going to make the choice to obey God.
Yeah. Otherwise, you turn into me, right? And that you don't want that.
Would be the worst.
Well, and that's the thing. I was just thinking, I saw over and over again when daughters went bad or made the choice to leave the home, the way they were spoken about in the communities. I mean, they were cut off from their families, and just the way I grew up hearing about them was so scary, and I never wanted to be one of those girls that left home and lost not just her, kind of her relationship with her family, but her whole community like that.
Yeah. So do the right thing, or we're going to treat you badly because we're going to kick you out and talk mean about you, just like that girl over there. But if you stay in line, then we'll be nice to you. That is not love. And that's not what God is like either. No. So what was it like? You lived in your parents' home as an adult. That admittedly, that is not an experience that I had. There were bumps to living outside of the home, and to be clear, I got married pretty young too. I got married at 21, so I didn't do too bad. I'm not that bad. But you both lived in your parents' home as an adult, and then you got married. Was it like being an adult, or was it like being a child?
So, I did actually have some time outside of my parents' home because at 24, I actually moved across the country to work for my husband's parents. And that was okay because they were like another family with a lot of kids and stuff. But when I was living in my parents' house, it was not like an adult kind of you're just renting a room situation. I was still considered to be under my parents' authority, and I did not have control over my time. I did not have control over what kind of ministries I would get involved in at church. Like anytime that I was out of the home, there was kind of this resentment, like you're taking something away that belongs to us. Like your time belongs to us, and your intellect and your energies belong here in the home, and you should be investing in the home. And the awkward thing was that my parents are not wealthy people. My dad is very blue collar, and he could not actually afford to keep 4 adult daughters at home without them working. So all of us did actually have jobs because it was just out of necessity. But the tough thing about that is that you go work at a job for 8 hours and then you come back and it's like, okay, now you need to do the stay-at-home daughter stuff, and you need to make dinner, and you need to help with the kids. And so none of your time is your own because you're either working at a job or you're doing your job at home.
Yeah. What about you, Audrey?
Yeah, I actually got married pretty young. I got married when I was, I'm trying to remember, it was in 2010. So I was 20. And it was just a really weird transition, though, because I had never been my own adult person, even living at home, where that is theoretically, that could be possible to have that independent or differentiated relationship with your parents with boundaries. That had never happened for me. And it was very much very similar to what Rachel was describing. Just everybody was expected to kind of use all of their time for the family's goals and schedule. And so I just went straight from that to getting married, which was another kind of big transition shock for me.
Yeah. I was thinking of the Pride and Prejudice. I'm 32. I'm unmarried. I'm already a burden to my family.
27.
Oh, 27. That's right. 27. So old at 27. You're right.
Audrey Vernier is an accomplished and acclaimed cellist who recently began to re-examine her goals, motivations, and purposes in life.
My peers and I began to develop a theology that would allow us to pursue our different interests, different desires, in my case, music, in a way that we wanted to. in my case, I wanted to perform. And to be able to perform, I felt I needed to go to a big name school and get to the top. And so when you use phrases like, well, God has given me this gift, I should use it, obviously. I should not waste this gift God has given me. Then you're able to justify whatever you want. I used to sincerely believe that I could pursue a degree in cello performance for the glory of God and get to the top and perform all around the world. And then I would be able to minister and talk about God because of my high position.
Are we letting the world define how we glorify Him?
Exactly. God does give us gifts, and we should use them to glorify Him. But we are letting the world define what success is and define how we should pursue these gifts. And we're taking this definition, which is very attractive because it's very self-glorifying, and saying that we can use it to glorify God. We just need to be at the top.
Audrey, you, like me as a therapist who works with young women now, I see that interview with you and I agree with Rachel, like you weren't going to stay in that. And it seemed clear that you were, in a way, being fed lines. Not entirely, but like they wanted you, they had an agenda and you were trying to do it, but you were trying to keep your agency intact.
Yeah, it definitely felt like there were very leading questions, and I think it definitely, the fact that I was being encouraged to go to music schools, I don't know if it mentioned that in the documentary, but my teachers were encouraging me to go make a career out of music. And I think that was I think they really did like that, just to make their point that I was choosing something else.
Yeah.
So
What schools did you look at, Audrey?
I did not even get to that point because it was just like
Oh.
so many tough conversations. I mean, my teachers did throw out names like Juilliard or Eastman, or even more local schools in Texas, like UT Austin had a really good music program, and then Rice University in Houston.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, but it was just, the conversations were so full of conflict between me and my parents, and not like ugly raised voices, but just kind of that, I wasn't getting anywhere and I felt really defeated, and like I had the moral low ground in wanting to pursue that. So, and the reality is I don't, like, academically, I think by that point, if I probably could have gotten in, just like my cello skills were good enough, I think, but I think I would have really struggled with the other academic requirements because I was just I had so many gaps. So, unfortunately, I think even by that point, I don't really even know if I would have made it.
Yeah.
That's so sad because, like, I mean, I'm a musician, so I look at that clip and, like, I'm not surprised to hear that your teachers were talking about Juilliard and other, like, high level music schools, because, like, I can tell from that clip that you were really good. Like, you would have had a shot at getting into, like, a big school, probably getting a scholarship. And to have that taken away, or to have your lack of confidence about your education to keep you from going through with that, is just and it makes me mad, because you'll always hear in these circles like, oh, homeschooling is actually academically superior and you're actually way smarter than the public schoolers. But meanwhile, like, if you fall behind, you're just behind.
I've heard story after story of that. I, as a public school kid, I was like, I came into the church and people were like, we're homeschooled and we're smarter than you. I was like, oh, I mean, I wish I had been homeschooled. And then I was like, wait, you all aren't actually teaching anybody anything. This is much worse than the education. Probably that's a sweeping generalization. I'm sure there are people who learned more, and there are people who homeschool for other reasons. But on the whole, I think I got a fabulous education in the
Yeah,
public school.
I mean, I think right now we've been homeschooling our boys, and it's taking so much work because I am with them or keeping them on track, and it's a lot of work. And I am determined to not, let them fall behind as much as I can.
Mm,
It's kind of exhausting to
yeah.
be in that space of homeschooling them or that season right now.
Yeah.
And I want to
Yeah.
point out that, like you were saying, Haley, there's so many different people who homeschool, and like this is not
Mhm.
about homeschooling in general.
Mhm.
People can do a really good job of homeschooling, but in these circles with the motivation that they had and with
Yeah.
the lifestyle that they had, a lot of times it was not even the parents doing the homeschooling.
Yeah.
It was the
Yeah.
stay-at-home daughters. Like that was one
Mm.
of the things that you could do with your time as a stay-at-home daughter is like, oh, good. Now you can teach, little Matthias math, so I don't have
Mm.
to do it anymore.
Mm.
So a lot of these hard decisions that parents made, and then like I'm thinking of the documentary that you were in, Audrey, how they were talking about all the sacrifices that their parents made to make these hard choices, and it's like, well, a lot of those sacrifices were kind of the children actually, the adult children would foot the bill for those, or even not adult,
Mm.
as they were getting into their preteens and teens, they would be expected to take on those kinds of parental responsibilities.
One of the terms that gets thrown around a lot in this stay-at-home daughter literature is helpmeet. Rachel, can you tell us, just in a nutshell, where this term comes from, what it means in the world of Christian patriarchy specifically, and the difference between what the Bible means about that?
I sure can. So the term "help me" is taken from Genesis 2:18, or specifically the King James version of Genesis 2:18, which says, "And the Lord said, it is not good for man to be alone. I will make a help meet for him." So it's important to ask, why was Eve suitable for Adam? And the reason why she was suitable for him is because she was like him. That's what Adam notices when he first sees her. And it's what our attention is drawn to in the narrative when God brings all of the animals in front of Adam. And it's like, nope, nope, nope. Those do not have the image of God. They are not equipped to be co rulers with Adam. So they're not going to work for this job. So we have to remember that dominion was actually an important part of this. She needed to be able to co-rule with Adam, which means that she was not part of the creation that was under his dominion.
Now, I'm going to read a quote and then we're going to discuss this. This is from Created to Be His Helpmeet by Debbie Pearl. We've talked about her before. And this is what Christian patriarchy means by helpmeet. God made you to be a helpmeet to your husband so you can bolster him, making him more productive and efficient at whatever he chooses to do. You are not the board of directors with an equal vote. You have no authority to set the agenda. But if he can trust you, he will make you his closest advisor, his confidant, his press secretary, his head of state, his vice president, his ambassador, his public relations expert, maybe even his speechwriter, all at his discretion. Audrey, do you have thoughts on that?
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's just all too familiar. And just so, putting the woman, what I noticed was putting the woman in the position of making sure that her appeal is enough or her behavior is enough to allow him to trust her. And that rings, very familiar in what I was taught just over and over. And also kind of in the way daughters were spoken to about their dads and like deserving their dad's protection. It just sort of like make sure that you deserve this place in your husband's life, and then you might get to write his speeches for him.
Yeah.
I saw
Yeah.
somebody say earlier this week, like on a TikTok or something, that patriarchal marriage is like DEI for men. So like they get trust, like they don't have to earn trust.
Mm.
They don't have to earn like a position of power or prove that they should be in this role. But women are never done proving that they belong in any role in patriarchy.
A lot of the stay-at-home daughter literature says, if you're a girl and you're living at home, what could be more natural than practicing for marriage by being your father's helpmeet? It sounds like it sounds good on the surface, right? Here's a quote from
I don't know
I mean,
if it even sounds good on the surface.
it doesn't not make sense on a very surface level way. The Botkins say, not Audrey Botkin, but in so much more, it says, quote, "I want to be a true helpmeet to my husband if I marry. And what an excellent opportunity I have to practice this with my own father." Okay, so how do they get there?
That's a good question. So they really are getting here because they're over prioritizing gender. Like it is the most important factor in any relationship, like almost overwhelming any other factor, whether it's age or experience or anything. Like nothing matters more than gender. So the way that they do this is they take texts that are specifically written to husbands and wives, and they apply them to the father-daughter relationship. So for instance, they apply Proverbs 31 to the father-daughter relationship and say, well, that means the daughter should be looking well to the ways of her household. And they mean like her family of origin household. Yeah. Or even Ephesians 5:33, where it says, see that the wife reverences her husband. They're like, well, that applies to the father-daughter relationship too. Probably the worst one is 1 Peter 3, where it's talking about the wife should be submissive and win her husband without a word. They're like, maybe that could apply if you have a deadbeat, horrible, abusive father. You could, yeah. So this makes for some pretty weird sexual dynamics, as you might imagine. I was watching a documentary about purity balls, which are a whole thing. We'll talk about that more in the next episode. But they are literally these ceremonies where the father is like walking his daughter down an aisle and she's wearing a white dress, and they're like signing covenants that she is going to like protect her heart and protect her sexual purity, or like let him protect it until she's married. So it's very, very strange. Another one, there was a Vision Forum father-daughter event where they had these little girls, I'm talking about like 5, 6, 7 years old, who are doing this activity where they're putting like shaving cream on their dad's faces and like shaving their fathers and tying their ties. And it's just like, for one thing, like, does anybody actually do that with their husbands?
No.
They're like, can we just say what we're all thinking?
You.
Yeah. It's hypersexualized and it's kind of sexually deviant is what it is. It's really gross. And keep in mind, we're talking about this as grown women, mothers who have husbands. We made babies. We know how it works. And so we can say that now. I am so curious about how this felt to the two of you while you were in this. Did it feel like silly and weird, or did it seem kind of like, oh yeah, this is just how it is? Because I don't actually know, and I don't think a lot of people do.
I was at several of those father-daughter retreats that Vision Forum held. I don't know if you ever went, Rachel, but it was, I think as I got older, it felt a little odd because it was just kind of like this level of intimacy that I didn't have with my dad, which I'm like glad that there wasn't that sort of intimacy.
Yeah.
But there was it was so normalized, and they were having this activity happen on stage in front of everybody. And so there were things that were, now looking back, I can't believe, that sort of thing was happening.
Yeah.
But it was just so normalized. I didn't have the education to know that it could be a problem.
Yeah. What about you, Rachel? Did it feel normal, or did it feel, I mean, we know what you think about it now, but how did it feel then?
I had a less traumatic experience with my dad because like that was not an issue with him as a person, but he was encouraged through, we were in IBLP, Bill Gothard's program. I didn't actually have a lot of experience with Vision Forum, but he was definitely encouraged, like, this is your job. You need to watch out for your daughter's modesty and purity, and monitor their relationships and stuff. So that made for a lot of really awkward conversations that I think my dad felt awkward about too. Like if I came down wearing something that he thought was immodest, actually it was usually my mom who would be like, tell her why it's immodest. And then he would have to say, well, this is how men are going to look at it, like in detail, which was like so icky. And my dad is not an icky person, but it's like it brings out the ick in everybody so that it can be normalized for the actual real creeps who are in those communities.
I think it injects creep and ick where there wasn't any, and then that's all any. That's how it works. If I tell you don't think of an elephant, you are thinking of an elephant. That's how it all works. And it's hypersexualization, and this is so much worse than me and my boyfriends that I had as a teen. I choose my life and not yours. Sorry.
Yeah, absolutely. But it's just inevitable when you blur these lines, when you're like, my daughter is kind of the same to me as my wife.
Yeah.
And actually my wife is kind of the same to me as a daughter. Like what do you expect to happen when you set up relationships that way?
Yeah. Well, it reminds me of that famous-ish comment from Vodi Balcom, who is in the clip from one of these documentaries, where he said, men they're all out there pursuing affairs with younger women, and what they should be doing is getting affection and attention from their daughters. What? What do you both think about that as the daughters who are the peers of, Vodi Balcom's daughter? Not that you're best friends with her, but you are her peers.
When the first time I saw that clip, I was just like, I'm not easily shocked by this stuff, and I was shocked.
What about you, Audrey?
I think, was that in Return of the Daughters?
No,
I think it was.
No, that was some other thing. Well, I don't know. I don't remember the first time I saw it, but I really don't think I reacted. Again, I think this has just been a gradual process of like becoming an adult myself, and then looking back and reflecting, like, that was so messed up. That's so problematic. I can't believe none of the other adults around me were like pointing this out, or standing up and saying, no, this is a problem. It's just very, very uncomfortable, very unfortunate to know that he was saying that to other people.
And I want to point out too that, like, it's so funny to me how my parents, and I'm sure your parents too, like, teenage boys were just automatically suspect. They are probably terrible people who just only want one thing. But older men, like, just flew right under that radar. There were so many things that I can look back on that I'm like, that was creepy and not normal. And it just didn't register with my parents because they were so busy, like, what is this 15-year-old boy going to do to my daughter?
Well, absolutely. And I was thinking about that when you were talking about, I choose my life, my normal teenage experience. And I think, yeah, you were experiencing developmentally appropriate milestones.
Yeah. Yeah.
While we were in a community that was letting older men, be really friendly
Mhm.
and handsy with the
Mm.
young women in the community.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Very blurred lines.
In the stay at home daughter movement, daughters are simultaneously infantilized and parentified. And we should understand what these terms mean. Infantilization means the prolonged treatment of one who is not a child as though they are a child. And then the flip side of that is parentification, which is when a child is given responsibilities that are appropriate to the parent role. We know men are supposed to be leaders, but then the responsibility goes on to women to influence them with Rousseau and Webster. So, in this gross way that we've talked about, women go into marriage thinking of husband as like, oh, this is basically like daddy 2.0. But then men going to marriage thinking of their wife as, oh, this is mommy 2.0. And so no one really gets to grow up. This is a thing that I deal with a lot as a therapist with men and women and couples. What do you both have to say about these dynamics?
I definitely have observed that in our marriage, we kind
Mm.
of went from being these little members of the family to having to be our full adults, and yet we hadn't really even experienced like an adolescence or
Mm.
a differentiation period from our parents, and so that did create just kind of a lot of unnecessary bumps along the way in learning how to relate to each other as adults with
Yeah.
our own boundaries.
What about you, Rachel?
I think of a friend of mine who was in a very similar family upbringing, who she was the oldest in her family, so she had a lot of responsibility, a lot of parentification going on with her. And she had younger brothers that she said, they grew up just not really having life skills and also not actually
Mhm.
having an education because nobody expected anything of them. So they
Mm.
were just, like Emile in Rousseau's book, like just kind of let to do their own thing.
Mm.
And in some ways, I feel like boys have it even worse because at least
Yeah.
girls have like these standards that they're expected to meet, and boys are just the fact that they're a male is supposed to be enough. And if they stay in the community, they know like somebody's probably going to give them a job because you're
Mm.
one of us.
I don't think they realize that little boys and girls being all grown up and being able to talk to the grown-ups and walk up to them and say, "Hello, my name is," and be like, that is a trauma response. That is not real. That's not normal. It's not a part of human development. You don't get to skip over adolescence and just be like this little teeny tiny grown-up. The rest of the world is like, "That's crazy." They're not like, "Wow, I wanna be like you." They're okay, we're gonna overlook that, but still be your friends, but we all see that there's something wrong with that because it's weird.
Mm-hmm. And I think that families in these communities have a really different idea of how people look at them. Like their
Mm.
idea of other people's perceptions of them is
Mm.
often very inaccurate. Like in one of the books, the one by Stacey McDonald called Raising Maidens of Virtue, which is
Mm.
exactly how it sounds. In her book, she talks about how people would think that her daughters were a lot older than they were when
Mm.
she was out with them in public because they would be like taking care of the kids, wiping their noses, and all that kind of stuff. So people just assumed like this 12-year-old must be much older than 12. And so they, in their minds, they're like, everybody must be so impressed with my kids. But
Mhm.
a normal person looks at that and is like, well, that's not normal.
That's not fair.
Mm-hmm.
It's not fair, and
It's
it
not
doesn't
fair.
honor human development, which you cannot escape.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that goes back to a lot of the quiver pull stuff that we were talking about, where, like, yes, any woman who pushes out 8, 9, 10 babies, that's a sacrifice.
Mm.
But what gets overlooked is that you are making decisions for your older children about the sacrifices they are going to make for your decisions.
Oh, did you live that oldest daughter life where you had to be so grown up?
I did, and I know it wasn't as extreme as some of my friends who grew up in the same circles, but we adopted my 3 youngest siblings, and so I was very hands-on for a good period, especially when they were needing to be like potty trained and dressed every day, and just kind of a lot of hands-on with that. But thankfully, I wasn't really made responsible for their education, and I never, was made responsible for disciplining them. But that was definitely the experience of a lot of girls that were brought up similar to how I was.
Yeah.
And I was not an oldest child. I was on the younger side. I was 6th born out of 10. But I experienced it kind of from the other end of like being pseudo parented by parentified older siblings. And that's confusing. And like the older that I get and being a mother, I'm realizing like how much I missed out on in my relationship with my mom, because like my siblings were doing the things that normally a mom or a dad would do. So it's very dysfunctional. So I talked about how there's this prioritization of maleness and femaleness to the exclusion of any other condition on a relationship, and how unhealthy that is. And I think along the lines of talking about education and formation, I think we really need to replace this spectrum that we have of male to female, like you're more male or more female, with a spectrum of immaturity to maturity. So boys, instead of thinking I'm going to grow up to become more and more masculine, they should be thinking about reaching maturity, and so should girls. So instead of thinking about growing up to be the perfect helpmeet and being submissive and like half of the human experience, because yes, deferring to other people, having social skills, those are part of the human experience. That's good, but you can't cut it in half and have one sex get one side and the other sex get the other side of being human. And I think we can look to the Proverbs 31 woman as a model of female maturity in a way that people in the stay-at-home daughter movement and other adjacent movements don't really look at it. Proverbs is actually a book that is written to boys who are being educated for rule. So you get all the way to the end of Proverbs, and you would expect at the end that there would be a picture of like the mature man as a model of like, this is what you can be if you embody this wisdom. And that's why it's so surprising when we get to the end that it's actually a woman that is at the end of Proverbs who is embodying all of these virtues and all of the wisdom that has been taught throughout the book. And I think that the key to the Proverbs 31 woman's wisdom is that she is a woman who fears the Lord. That's where her wisdom comes from. And she fears the Lord instead of fearing man. So instead of orienting her entire formation around what men want or what some imaginary future spouse might want, she is thinking about God's perspective on things, and she is allowing her knowledge and her values to be informed directly by God rather than mediated through men.
Thanks for being with us today. If you're enjoying this, you may be wrestling with other questions like, is hell just a prison and God holds the keys? Should Christians just accept climate disasters and the suffering of the masses? Should Christians just dominate the public square? Have we inherited the most accurate version of the Christian faith? We tackle issues like these head on. If you want bread and butter resources, check out our Bible studies and evangelism tools and spiritual formation material. If you want answers to tough questions, check out Reconstruction. If you want to live out Christian restorative justice, check out Along Repentance, or Plantation Capitalism versus Jesus' Jubilee Economy, or Abortion Policy in the U.S. You can find our content on our website, our YouTube channel, and on our asynchronous learning platform, or join a live class with one of our instructors. We want to connect with you, whether you're a believer or a skeptic.